Hey gang, it's Neil Whitman, the old soldier back, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about having a mentally and spiritually healthy response to all of the information that is kind of streaming at us about things going on in the world. Recently talked about the events that took place in the United States where there were a number of rioters that had taken control of Capitol Hill briefly, the Capitol, I should say, and that were certainly branded afterwards as domestic terrorists or insurrectionists by many, and arguably that was their intent, if not their effect. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that it was deeply alarming for a lot of people, and there was very real fear, and I think rightly so continues to be fear about the instability going on in the United States. And of course, that just compounds with the coronavirus, things that are going on, and people trying to understand how to take a stance on that. Whether they should be concerned about the government restrictions, which frankly you probably should be, because regardless of how real the virus is, governments have historically used crises, however real, to solidify control over freedoms of their subjects and don't often give them back afterwards. So that's certainly something to be mindful of when you're talking about this. And also just the sickness itself and the danger to health. Vaccines that are getting pushed out, and are they safe or are they not safe? They were tested a very short time. All this stuff is coming at us. And how are we supposed to respond to that? What I'd said in my last video was speaking to the desire to restore the yesterday freedoms and peace and prosperity that we knew, and kind of the fruitlessness of that, because we can't really put our hope in these things, knowing that ultimately nations fail. I get a lot of feedback on that, some very positive and some quite negative. Some accusations about blackpilling. That internet jargon, for those who aren't familiar with it, which speaks to basically nihilism and despair and, kind of doomerism, if you will. Which is an interesting observation, because if you don't have a sense of doom in your long-term outlook of any institutional human effort, then you're really being rather naive. Maybe I'm just too cynical, but history will demonstrate that every nation does face crises, and regardless of whether or not that's true, that humans die. That's like 100% positive that that's going to happen. And we do need to confront these things. We need to be honest with ourselves about what our real hope is. But by no means was I trying to suggest that there is no point in exerting efforts to have a positive effect in your own life and the lives of your family, community, society, and nation. But I do want to talk about how you can do that in a way that actually can be fruitful, as opposed to the despair addled efforts that I think we are being driven to in our current environment, with access to means of communication and technology that have historically just not been a part of the human experience, and which we're not really terribly well prepared to integrate into our ideological worldview. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I was taking my daughter out to lunch today, and this would be my youngest daughter, who's 8 years old, and she, I don't know, maybe noticed some snowflakes and had just sort of idly mused, why do they sing that song, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow? It's not like they have a choice as to whether or not it snows. It's going to snow if it snows. And I said, I suppose unless you're Elsa And then I guess maybe you can say that because you have some effect on whether or not it snows. Elsa the Snow Witch from that horrible and depraved Disney movie that came out a little while ago. Truly the worst one they've ever made, in Neil Whitman's personal opinion. Just lacked substance. But that's neither here nor there. Uh, the point is that this 8-year-old child was expressing a very important truth about the way that we respond to things outside of our control. We either declare acceptance with them and get on the bandwagon, or we strive to fight against things which, really are completely outside of our control. Like you can rail and scream at the sky, you can light bonfires and try to increase the greenhouse gases to hasten global warming, but if it's snowing right now, you aren't going to stop it from snowing right now by any efforts that you are going to make in your own strength. That's just reality, right? I think we all get that. And yet, we act in so many spheres outside of our control, as though we have some sort of impact on what's going to happen. And I want to talk about a really simple concept, but it may not be one that you're terribly familiar with, because it's not one we talk about a lot. We don't educate our children in this. It's not something that we train our youth for, probably even in most of the churches, in understanding. But it's a very eminently military concept. And what that is are the, what I'm going to just call the sphere of control, the sphere of influence, and the sphere of interest, right? So sphere of control, sphere of influence, and sphere of interest. What that means, it's like if you were using that as a planning tool, you would evaluate those things which you actually have control over. Like you can decide the outcome of, depending on how you exert your efforts. And you place those inside your sphere of control and you decide what you're going to do with them. Those are the tools that you can then send out into your sphere of influence in order to try and have an effect in that region outside of your direct control, where you can take actions that influence things that happen there. And then your sphere of interest is those things which are going to affect you, but which you have no influence over. Do you get that? So, sphere of control, those things that I can directly decide the outcome of. Sphere of influence, a place where I can act and cause an effect, but I'm not the only actor, so there's other influencers in that sphere, and I can try and steer what goes on there, but I can't actually determine the outcome because there's other things in play. And of course, the things which are going to influence me, but I can't return the favor. So a very simple way of looking at this would be, if you were looking at it using a military analogy, like depending upon your where you fit in the hierarchy of the military, if you were just a private soldier, your sphere of control is yourself. It's your equipment that's been put into your care. You can maintain that equipment, right? You can ensure its function. You can hone your own skills with that equipment by training. You can train your body and make sure that it's fit and physically ready for the tasks that are coming. You can train your mind by taking time to understand tactics and drills, and you can train your mind by higher learning for critical thinking, and you can train your mind by understanding the things that are outside of your control so that you're ready to deal with them and cope with them when they happen. But that's about it, right? Like it's just you. Now you may end up progressing in the hierarchy. And for the sake of argument, we'll say that soldiers are all loyal and they do exactly what they're told and understand what they're told. Well, then they fall into that sphere of control for their sergeants or their captains. And as a sergeant, you might have 8 guys, and you can direct them to do specific things. You control what they do, right? Um, what you don't get to do as a sergeant is control the guys in the section beside you. They're under someone else's control, right? So if you want to influence them, you have to talk to their sergeant and say, hey, this is what I think you guys should be doing. Or you talk to the captain and say, hey, boss, I've got an idea of how we might be able to do this more effectively. This is what I've been doing. Maybe we could get all of the sections doing it. So they're inside the sphere of influence, and they're really closely inside. Like, you can pretty easily influence what they do by demonstrating a better way, by talking about it. But then you go to the next company over, and they're still on your side, but they're fairly well removed. You know, you can still talk to their sergeant and stuff, but they're not under your platoon commander. They're not even under your company commander. So, you know, if their company commander is directing they do something completely differently, and their platoon commander agrees that that's the way to do it, your influence is very minor compared to the influence of those guys on top. And then, like, we get into the field of the enemy, right? So that's talking about on our own side, trying to influence tactics and behaviors and drills and the way that we want to approach the task in front of us. When you start talking about the enemy in that sphere of influence outside your direct control, well, you can steer his behavior using deception, using maneuver, trying to use the tools at your disposal to try and get them to do what you want them to do, and ultimately lead them to defeat. But you don't control them. Like, they're actively trying to resist your influence and do something different from what you want them to do. So that's a really tricky one, and you have to be extremely careful about how you approach it. And if you're not in a concerted effort with a larger body that is all working together on the same plan, then you're probably not going to succeed in influencing that enemy the way you want to. Of course, there's also the neutrals in that territory. You know, there's the civilian guys and the refugees and, you know, the other nations, like, you know, the Chinese spies on every street corner in Afghanistan when we were there, or the, no doubt, Russians that were hanging out and whatnot. Well, you know, those guys, they're not, you don't even necessarily know what they're up to, and it's a lot harder to influence them. So you can try, but, you know, if we're talking about civilians, you want to try and get them to support your cause, or at least stay out of the way. But the enemy is going to be doing the exact opposite, trying to, you know, make them interfere with what you're doing and support their cause, either knowingly or unknowingly. And those are things you have to contend with if you're going to engage in that sphere of influence. And then there's things which are like way out on the fringe. Like, you're talking tactical battlefield stuff here. Yeah, right, great. So you can get in on that, and you can at least engage with the enemy. But, like, your government, try to affect national strategy? Well, you can, you know, like, there's certainly things that can be done, and usually not intentionally, which have national impact when you're the sergeant. But they're probably going to be negative things usually if you're happening to directly, as a sergeant, affect national strategy, unless it's like you won a Victoria Cross and you enhance the morale of everyone by your great glorious action. Now that's you as the sergeant. The general actually has a fair bit of influence on his government, but still it's limited, you know? And then, of course, with the enemy's higher echelon that's like 5 steps removed from the guy that you're shooting at in the field, like, your ability to influence him is real small. at your level if you're a sergeant. Even if you're an enemy general, like, sorry, if you're a friendly general and you're dealing with that enemy governing body, um, you can do your job and you can get your guys lined up and unified in an effort against them. And I am going somewhere with this, okay? Hear me out. Then it comes to things like the weather. Well, the weather's going to affect you and everything that you do inside your sphere of influence and also inside your sphere of control. It's going to affect how much control you have. There's other things that, your food supply, if it's not something that you are personally gathering, is it's coming from outside, and it's an area of interest, but you don't actually control what's happening with that, right? You can ask for it, and you might have that influence, but you haven't got the ability to create it, so you're kind of beholden to the logistics chain and to the enemy to not disrupt it, for example, and so on and so forth. I remember getting pinned down in Strong Point for like a week because the Taliban were hitting all the fuel trucks coming in, and we didn't have any fuel to roll. And that stuff happens, like, totally outside of our sphere of control, totally outside of our sphere of influence. Like, we had to rely on way higher assets than us to deal with whoever was doing that, to free up the lines of communication to get fuel into us. Nothing we could have done about it except report that it was a thing, and they already knew. So you just carried on, defend yourself, hunker down, get ready for probably getting hit a few times, so on and so forth, and wait it out and let the guys that can do something about this do it. Maybe pass on information if you happen to have any. Right? Like, this is pretty basic stuff. And then we go into our private, personal lives, and it's like we don't even acknowledge that this is a thing. There are things you control, there are things you influence, and there's things that influence you that you can't control. And how much effort are you putting into those things? Is it actually based on your ability to have an effect? So when we talk about politics and viruses and government responses to those viruses, what are you presuming that your ability to influence those things is? It's not nothing, right? Like, you, for example, have a vote. You may actually get to influence somewhat how other people vote, as long as they trust you and they're movable enough to actually respond to what you're saying. It's possible you might convince people to vote a certain way in a very small body of undecided persons kind of in the middle. You might be able to encourage your government through your personal response to them that certain measures are draconian and unfair, so you can let your voice be heard. You could participate, as happened in Italy, in what is effectively an uprising, a peaceful uprising, where all the restaurants, I think 50,000, opened all at once and everybody got on board. You can do that. And that requires some attention and coordination. But what I'm trying to say here is that the stuff you actually control is your daily life. You control what you do with your own time and with your own strength and with your own mind. These are things that you have a measure of control over. It's not universal there either. I mean, you can lose your strength, you can lose your mind. Something may interfere and take away your time. All of that stuff is true. But the only thing you totally control is yourself. You have a fair degree of control over your own personal family, um, particularly if your kids are younger, in the example that you set them, in the things that you teach them, in how you're going to use your time to influence them in a way that you think is positive. You have a fair degree of influence in your close family and friend groups, which you can use positively. If you belong to a church, you have probably, a substantial influence in that body that you can influence that community positively by putting your efforts into that community, which, interestingly, if you are a Christian, that's what you're supposed to be doing. The much cited command that is found in the New Testament that we are not to forsake the fellowship or the gathering together of one another is explicitly in that context so that you can encourage other people and stimulate them to good works, not so that you can go and get served. It's about you going and serving people. It's a pretty good principle. You can actually influence whether or not you serve other people in any context, guys. So if you're like, oh, what's the church talk about? In any context, you only influence how you can benefit others. That's what you control. I mean, you don't control whether or not other people serve you and benefit you, but you're a lot more likely to influence them to do that if you start by serving them. You start to get some of these concepts. It's pretty basic stuff here, right? But then what actually happens so often, and I think in large part it's because of a new means of communication, social media, which has kind of upset our experience of influence from our traditional experience of influence, right? And a historical one. So, do you actually have influence outside of your personal social circles? Well, you can. Like, you can engage in participating in public protest. You can participate in movements that are petitioning the government or seeking to bring about a change in policy through lobbying methods or something like that. You can do that. And I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. But you need to be realistic about how you're dividing your time in those things, right? If you have the most influence in your own friend and family group, and you spend 10% of your time on that, and 90% of your time that is free past, what you need to do to work and just provide a life for yourself, right? So if your free time is being cut up with like 10% for your family and 90% family and friends, 90% is going into like participating in watching YouTube videos, like maybe this one, and getting involved in conversations online on conspiracy theory, concerns about what the government is trying to do, and advocating on your social media for people to wake up and smell the fresh coffee of what's being brewed in Washington or Ottawa or Berlin or Moscow. I don't know. How much is that the right amount of allocation? If you've devoted 90% of your time to an organization, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's a pro-life movement, and you're trying to change the national policy because you think there's a huge systemic problem with racism or murdering babies, But you're not actually spending time in your personal relationships being an example and an encouragement to those people. Are you actually profiting society as best as you can? This is the question you got to ask. Because if you want to think of an example of someone who profoundly impacted a moral problem in his society, you could easily turn to William Wilberforce. And if you don't know who William Wilberforce is, he's an English parliamentarian who devoted his entire life as an adult and parliamentarian to the abolition of slavery. And he ultimately he influenced Britain to the place of passing laws of abolition. And it took him like 40 years of devoting most of his time and attention to this thing. He was Elsa, in my daughter's example. He had a platform from which to actually be speaking into the lives of all Britons and to be challenging in public debate the idea that slavery was essential to the economic welfare of the British Empire, and advocating for, by bringing to light the horrific treatment of the slaves and all of that to the public and to Parliament. He influenced over the course of many years of very hard labor that nation, and ultimately that led to the abolition really in America and across the Commonwealth of slavery, and arguably started a domino effect that put an end to the slave trade, barring that it still happens to some extent in some backwater spots, like Dubai, but that's neither here nor there. But across the world, and that was really good. That was a solid thing that he did, but he didn't do it alone. Like William Wilberforce didn't do that. He brought it to everyone's attention from his position of having a voice, and then pastors preached it. Blokes talked about it in pubs. Mothers taught their children what they had believed was right, and fathers taught their children and talked to their neighbors and challenged these things and stopped having slaves and stopped trading with people who were gaining their wealth through the slave trade. And this movement spread through individual hard work and decisions and building of an idea within their own relationships, right? So understand who you are in this equation. Because if you're spending all your time on your bloody Facebook page, passing on memes and reiterating in the echo chamber that Biden is the great Satan or Trump is the great Satan and we all need to do something about it, like, cool. Then go and love your family and help your neighbor and get involved in your church and treat the people there with respect and dignity and build up a principled example to others that they will then follow and emulate as they're shamed by their own poor behavior to others. And you know what happens when we do that? Is the whole society gets this virus that spreads out and it revolutionizes things. What the social media thing does is the opposite. It actually it demands that you tyrannically clamp down. You say, we must take hold of the schools again. I agree. I agree with that sentiment, absolutely. But if you do it by force instead of by winning over the other side, then all you've done is created the seeds of rebellion and overthrow. You need to win it through the moral argument of your personal life devoted to those good things inside your sphere of control, put into the real sphere of influence that you have. And something to just understand here is like, know how big your lever is, okay? Like, you have a really big lever in the life of your child. Fact. And I don't care if they are grown up. There's that teenage period where, in many cases, that might have been diminished. But kids care what their parents think. They may rebel against it. They may not want to care, but they do. So set an example for them. Not just force them, but like set an example, love them, treat them with dignity and respect like fellow human beings, and exemplify the good that you want to see in them as you reinforce it with your words and your actions. In the life of your friends and your personal relationships, be involved, be selfless, be the person who seeks to do for them what you can, and to encourage that behavior in them. Like, this is very basic stuff here, but it's it's also real easy not to do it. The call of Christ for his followers was to be salt and light in the world, right? Those who season and preserve, those who bring light. You are to be the city on a hill, right? You're to be the lamp that is not put under a basket. You don't put the lamp under the basket. You shine it in the dark place. That isn't bleeding out angry comments on your Facebook page or your MeWe page or your Twitter or your Discord. It's living in the lives of other people. So work inside your sphere of control. You want to change society. That's how it happens. Do you know why the Netherlands had an empire? Like, make sense of that. Like, the Netherlands, not exactly a huge country, nevertheless, an extraordinarily prosperous country through colonialism, and you might want to, challenge the morality of that, but they became powerful because every person in that society believed that their best work was to live righteously amongst other people and towards their neighbor and to work hard, because the way that we become great is if I work hard at the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. Britain became a powerhouse nation because their individual, and yeah, I know these things are super nuanced and we can talk about all kinds of socio-political factors that led to these things, but because individuals chose that it would be their service to God to be faithful in their work and to be good to one another. And yeah, they had their civil wars, I know all that stuff. And yet, in the main, they behaved a lot better towards one another than humans generally do. If you're not familiar with it, there's a book by a guy named, I'm going to mangle this. The book is titled The Book That Made Your World. And I'm actually just going to look this up before I mangle the poor fellow's name. It's the power of having Google at your fingertips, eh? The Book That Made Your World by Vishal Mangalwadi. Vishal Mangalwadi is an East Indian bloke. And that book is worth reading because it challenges our Western perception of why we do the things that we do. And what he's basically saying is you don't understand how important the Bible is in making the West the West. Coming from India, life is different because the personal responsibility to God to be righteous is not understood the same way. And the universal worth of humanity is not understood the same way. Like, yeah, granted, we had our black spots, right? And we definitely have some pretty bad skeletons in the closet. I get that. And yet, even in that, we were still driven by principles that made us good or better than we would have been otherwise. And arguably, in spite of all the bad stuff that the West can be accused of having done, and, like East India Trading Company is not exactly a shining example of Christian morality, nor were a lot of the treatments that were given to other colonial subjects. I get that. And if you're First Nation, you probably have some feelings about saying Britain was a moral nation, but it was. Like, compared to what the Celtic savages were, the Germanic savages who who the Romans met, compared to the Romans themselves, like, man, do you have any concept of what savagery it was to live in Greece or Rome and how little respect they had for human life? Like, anyway, I'm diverting here. The point is that those nations became great and forces of moral good, and eventually came to things like abolition because individuals chose to live their lives faithfully in their own communities and to share ideas that were inherently good. Fundamental principle in Scripture is, do not take vengeance for yourself. Do not repay evil for evil, for vengeance is mine, says the Lord, and I will repay it. Instead, if your enemy is thirsty, give him water to drink, and if he's hungry, give him food to eat, and in so doing, you will heap burning coals upon his head. Man, like, you want to talk about what you can control? It's your response to injustice. And if you respond to injustice with generous heartedness, you can possibly actually change the perspective of that other person. And maybe not, and maybe the concentration camps that everyone fears and are not beyond our human ability to accomplish, maybe the experience of guys like Solzhenitsyn may actually come to our land sometime in the future. Hope not, I mean, like I said in our last video, probably at some point, if it's not this year, probably in the next 200 years at some point, we're going to go there. It's a pretty historically solid expectation for any group of people that will start the genocides on each other or some terrible civil war and all that. But the only thing you can do about that is not to participate by trying to destroy your enemy. Like, that crap is what caused the French Revolution, which, if you're not familiar, wasn't a good time, the Reign of Terror, the overthrow, it's, and it wasn't a good time before that either. So, if you want to change the world, then love your neighbor and do good in the sphere that you actually can control. Now, also, here's a real principle that needs to be understood. You can't control the past, right? And you can't control the future. So all you can actually do is control the now, the thing that you're going to do next. That's not saying don't plan. Like, for crying out loud, people accuse me of blackpilling again. But yeah, fine, plan. But the old military adage is pretty reliable in life. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Have a plan, but spending all your time planning what you're going to do next year is kind of dumb. Give it 10% of your time and give 90% of your time and attention to what you're doing right now and what you're going to do today. Let tomorrow worry about itself. For who of you by worrying can add even 1 hour to his life? A little biblical wisdom for you there. Swear by nothing. Swear neither by God, nor by heaven, for it is throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor even by your own head, for you cannot change one hair on it from black to white. What are you spending all your time saying what you're going to do tomorrow? You don't know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. You could have a freaking heart attack or an aneurysm, and then today was what you got. So have a plan. Don't be foolish, but devote most of your time to what you're doing right now. Devote most of your time into the relationships that you have. And the past, whoa, boys, can we ever spend a lot of time wasted moaning about what we didn't do, or what we should have done, or how we used to act, and can't we go back to that? Wasn't life great back before 9/11? Cool, yeah, but you can't live there, so that sphere of interest, right? The sphere of influence is the future. The sphere of control is the present. The sphere of interest is the past. The only value that has for you is the information it gives you about what might or might not work in your current situation. Beyond that, seek forgiveness and carry on, right? I've talked about this before, so I won't go into a giant rant about it, but good comes when everyone does good within their own sphere of control. That is the means of true revival and revolution. Now, as to whether or not you are capable of doing good, well, I'd say seek God for that. Is the ability to do good inside your own sphere of control? Well, consistently, probably not. If you really weigh yourself, are you consistently able to treat others with dignity and worth? Are you consistently able to be unselfish in a good way? I'm not saying being recklessly selfless and hating yourself, but unselfish towards others. Are you consistently able to love? Well, if not, and if that's something that you struggle with, then go to God. He's got what you need. And he's got the forgiveness for each time you fall down, and the wisdom for each time you actually ask him for it for the next step. But yeah, let's stop whining about the way things are, and let's, by all means, voice our genuine concerns intelligently and participate in the collective effort to try and bring about good, but focus 90% of your time on the levers you have real, actual leverage with. Use your 10-foot steel bar in your personal relationships and spend most of your effort on that. And then maybe, you might give some time, give your 10% to the 3-inch wrench that you're trying to ratchet that wheel nut off with, which is the government of your country or the prevailing ideological worldview through public petition. So that's my advice to you. I think if you follow it, you will find that your life is not only a lot less anxious, but much more fruitful. And that is, in fact, the way that we win against the powers of darkness that would seek to throw us into civil chaos and dismay. So those are my thoughts, and Godspeed.